joining me today is Mr. Dan Grazier. Dan and I have known each other for a very long time, and I am more than honored to have you as my very first interview in a series that I'm conducting, 100 Years of Marine Corps Tankers. And although I know you very well, and I'm sure a lot of the audience knows you very well, I'm going to go ahead and run through your bio if you don't just give me a minute here. Commissioned in 2005 through OCS. You graduated AOBC in 2006. At which time you commanded 2nd Platoon Bravo Company, 2nd Tanks from 2006 to 7. During that time, you deployed to Iraq. And then as a TOW platoon commander in November 2007 and 2008, you deployed once again. And then you came to Fort Knox, the Marine Corps Detachment, in 2008 to 11. And then there you held basically every key billet you can hold, the OPSO, MTC commander, AOBC tactics instructor. And then in 2011 and 12, you went to Resident Expeditionary Warfighting School, and then out to First Tanks, which I'm sure we're all very familiar with. From 2012 and 15, I think that's generally when our timeline kind of crossed over. And then H&S Company, Bravo Company as a CO, and did an individual augmentation deployment to Afghanistan with RCT-7 in summer of 2013, and then returned back to First Tanks as the S3. And since 2015, you've worked as a historian on the Project on Government Oversight in Washington, D.C., which is where you are currently working. So, Dan, on behalf of 100 Years of Marine Corps Tankers, welcome. It is my honor. And the first question I'm going to ask you is, what is the first thing you think of when you hear of Marine Corps Tankers?
Oh my God. The first thing just has to be all the hardworking Marines. So I think about the tank mechanics who worked all night turning wrenches to fix the tanks that we broke during the day so we could continue going down range. You know, I think about the Marines who suffer through the cold and the heat, sitting inside those big giant iron beasts. When the one story that really sticks out in my mind as far as that goes, I think back to my 2007 deployment with 2nd Platoon Bravo Company. And I remember the date. It was July 24th, 2007. It was the hottest day during our deployment. It got up to about 130 degrees outside, and the ammo temp in our tank when we climbed on in the evening to go out on this early evening mission was 140 degrees. And it was just absolutely brutal. And we had 2 heat cases. We had one in my wingman's tank that was bad enough that we had to evac the entire section back to an army position that was behind us to get him treated. But while we were doing that, we had another heat case. It was the gunner on my 3 tank. But so I was in a real dilemma about what do I do with them? And then all of a sudden my platoon sergeant reported up to me that they were okay because the gunner on the 3 tank had given, or I'm sorry, the loader on the 3 tank had given my gunner in that tank an IV. And so Corporal Mitch Kiko was maintaining his sector of fire with an IV sticking in his arm. Because they didn't want to quit. They didn't want to have to evac and have to, basically give up, bail on the mission. So I think about guys like that. That was, while that's just one story, there's all kinds of stories, and about Marine tankers, fighting through really significant challenges to get the mission done to protect the rest of the Marines, because that's basically what we do in tanks. That's certainly what we did during that deployment in 2007. And it was always amazing to see. Like, these guys never ever failed to impress me with their fortitude and their dedication to their very important role.
Absolutely. And you brought out so many great points there. One, Marine Corps tankers are problem solvers, critical thinkers, getting the job done, doing the mission. I mean, heck, pulling your sector with an IV out of your arm. I mean, just incredible story there. I guess the next question would kind of be along the same lines, phrased slightly different. We'll see if I can pull out another experience from you. What is your most memorable experience in the Abrams?
Wow, there's a whole bunch of those too. I would have to say probably my favorite moment on tanks was always the moment that we came back from a successful mission or a successful training evolution. So I love that moment during my Iraq deployment when we'd come through the main gate at Camp Fallujah and we'd pull into the fueling point. And that moment where I would hop off the tank and walk in front of this incredible machine as we were walking through to refuel, knowing that we had accomplished the mission. So that thrill and that pride never ever left me. I mean, we ran over 200 combat missions in Iraq during that summer, and I never got tired of that. I never got tired even of having that same moment when we would come back from gunnery at from SR10 and floating the tanks across the river and then coming through the back gate at the tank ramp, and that moment of just hopping off the tank and proudly walking in front of it, just to the wash rack, like that. Those moments were always really great, and seeing the Marines be successful in what we were doing was always like a really incredible experience. And I think back to when I commanded Bravo Company and going to gunnery, like that was a big challenge at that point. That was in December of 2012, and so the bulk of the battalion had only gotten back from a deployment where they served as like route clearance or route security. So they were on trucks, and I had a lot of Marines that hadn't been on tanks for a long time, and so trying to get them back into just being basically qualified tankers was a bit of a challenge. I was greatly assisted by my tank leader, Master Sergeant Chris Willenbecker, like an absolute legend, like one of the best Marine tankers that I ever knew. Staff Sergeant Kenneth DeWitt, who was my master gunner, he was one of the best master gunners that I worked with, and we focused intensely before we went out to gunnery just on basic TCGST skills and almost the exclusion of all else. And so because we needed that work, but when we went out to range 500, these guys stepped up, and even though they were a lot of them were inexperienced. A lot of my junior tank crewmen had never shot a gunnery in the fleet before, but they all stepped up. They'd all absorbed what they needed to know, and we had some growing pains out there, of course, but they stepped up, and we qualified every crew Q1, and it was I was hugely impressed because I did not expect that, and but they all stepped up and did it. So. That was probably my proudest moment when that last crew finished qualification and we tabulated their score and it was Q1. I was just so impressed with what they had accomplished. So it's those kind of things that stick out to me as my favorite moments on the Abrams.
That's awesome. I mean, you covered combat and you covered training in that answer. I'm going to circle back to the combat missions for a moment. So one of the things that I think it's important, is particularly since this is the inaugural interview, is to kind of discuss the role of the Marine Corps tanker, because obviously, we know the Army has tanks, but the Marine Corps tanks, I think, our mission set was different during those combat operations, and specifically regarding the combat support element, where we as Marine Corps tankers support that grunt, support that infantryman. And that's a little bit different than our counterparts in the Army, and also in some of the other countries that we serve with. Can you expound on that just a little bit?
Sure. So my deployment was in 2007, which means that most of the deployments where people were slinging main gun rounds downrange had ended. My platoon did not fire a main gun round in anger. I think our whole company only fired one during that deployment. So ours, you're gonna have to talk to somebody else about a Phantom Fury and those kind of missions, because that was definitely not what we were doing. What we did was a lot of support of like 2-6 in the city of Fallujah, and I ran a lot of missions with Charlie Company 1st Recon Battalion, which was a bit of an odd pairing. The first time that was proposed, that I was going to take a tank section, I was going to work with a recon company. I thought that was the this is the oddest thing I've ever heard, but we made it work. And it wasn't, they weren't the most exciting missions ever, particularly for for my crewmen, because a lot of it was just, we were just posting Overwatch, or we were strong pointing a patrol base. And so they're not very exciting missions, but they were really important, because what we figured out, well, that we'll go back to that first mission that I ran with Recon. They were occupying a patrol base, and they were going out doing their normal recon missions at night when they normally do those kind of things. But during the day, they just needed to rest and refit in this house. But what happened was, all the bad guys knew exactly where they were, and so they were attacking this house with technical vehicles, and it was just harassing fire all day. And so they wanted some tanks to come up and hopefully blast these technical vehicles that kept attacking them. Well, the technical vehicles did not show up at all when we were there, because they knew the tanks were there. And so we built on that, and Recon, every time they went out to do one of these missions, they requested us to come up and help out, where we would basically just post the tanks out in front of their patrol base, and they could do their recon missions at night, and they could rest and refit during the day, because no one was going to come and mess with them when the tanks were there. And so we jokingly referred to that as a blanket of freedom mission, which we repeated again and again. I did it with Recon a number of times, but then we would do it with, at the beginning of the surge. And I can't think of the operations name, but it was when then Lieutenant Colonel Mullen decided that he was going to cordon off the city of Fallujah, and he was going to try to channelize the city by throwing up a bunch of barriers to force the enemy to evac into our engagement areas. My friend Justin Hunter, who was the engineering platoon commander in charge of actually executing that, I went out and worked with him, where we just post up tanks in Overwatch, and so they could emplace their barriers without anybody messing with them. And so we repeated that again and again. Like, an infantry battalion needed to set up a patrol base, so we would go and do that with them, or they needed to conduct census operations, and so we take a tank section out, and we would move through the town with them as they were doing that, and no one was going to mess with them when the tanks were around, because they didn't want to have to deal with us. So again, it wasn't the most exciting kind of missions, definitely not the kind of missions that tankers really sign up for, but I know with every fiber of my being that there are a number of Marines that came home in one piece that would not have otherwise had we not been there. And so I think that was the real value of Marine tanks, that we were organic to the Marine Corps. So we were there, we were available, no one was going to steal us away, and we could support the infantrymen and the engineers and whoever else on the ground as they were doing their jobs. So there's great value added to that, and it contributes to economy of force. It definitely cuts down on certainly cuts down on casualties, and it really made a lot of those missions a lot smoother than they probably otherwise would have been.
No, it's a great point. I think you're selling yourself short, because I think deterrence and having us out there, right alongside of our brothers and sisters during those operations and during those missions, I think that was just value added. And, I hope that if nothing else from this video series, those types of stories come out, because I think they're extremely important. This is just a way for us to kind of capture that. And I really appreciate you providing that. That's great stories and very, very, very telling. So if you're looking at Dan and you're thinking to yourself, where do I know him from? He has been kind of showcased on a national level. I'm going to put you on the spot here. I know you've been on Fox News and some other things. Can you kind of give us a rundown of where people are saying, man, I know him. Where do I know him from?
Well, I'm probably best known now, unfortunately, for being the most vocal opponent to the F-35. When I left the Marine Corps in 2015, I had already lined up my current position with a project on government oversight, and so I started working here in Washington while I was still officially on terminal leave. So I guess it was still technically on active duty when I started this. so I work as I'm a historian. I'm a military historian, and that's generally how I describe myself. But the reality of what I do is I'm a professional military reformer. And so our organization was founded in 1981. It was originally called the Project for Military Procurement. And it was founded by a group of Pentagon whistleblowers that were all kind of intertwined with the John Boyd military reform movement. So all Marines should know who John Boyd is. And he had a core group of friends working in and out of the Pentagon and on Capitol Hill, and they had a couple of key messages that that they wanted to get out, but the media environment in the early 1980s was basically the big three networks and the Washington Post and New York Times. And so they found it really difficult to get their story told the way that they thought they needed it to be told, just because they had those limited outlets. And so they banded together and they got some financial support, and they created the Project for Military Procurement to basically be a front for the reform message that they were trying to put out. And the organization has grown and expanded over the years, but I kind of work right in the middle of the core mission of that original founding, which is to make public military reform issues that don't otherwise get the attention that they deserve, even in the expanded media environment. So we're basically the only organization out there who does not take any money from the defense contractors. And so I have a free reign to say what needs to be said, and I don't have the constraints of upsetting either direct financial supporters or advertisers.
Understood. So circling back to tanks, how do you think being a Marine Corps tanker has shaped the way that you are today?
Oh, wow. Well, so being a tank officer in particular has, I mean, it had a huge impact. I mean, just on a personal level, just having the ability to kind of think through big, complex problems, the kind of problems that tanks and a tank unit will present you, has been hugely valuable. So, I have the confidence to be able to really tackle any kind of problem that's thrown at me now, because most of them kind of pale in comparison to, having a tank stuck in the mud and, having track break when you're 50 kilometers away from your support and threatened by snipers. So, that has certainly helped put a lot of things in perspective. As far as just being a military thinker, it's helped a lot, because the tanker's view of the battlefield is a lot broader than other military professionals. So, I mean, it's often been said that, like, an infantryman, considers grid squares, whereas a tanker thinks at least terrain features, if not map sheets.
Yep.
And so that gave me an interesting perspective, and one that I did not appreciate in a really serious way until I got to EWS in 2011, because it was there when all of a sudden I'm thrown into, my conference group had a bunch of really great officers across a number of military specialties, but I was the only tank officer in there. And it was just really interesting to see how we would approach the different problems that were thrown at us in unique ways. And I'm not saying that ours was necessarily always the best one, but I definitely thought about these things in bigger terms than some of my classmates. And I mean, occasionally, I can think of one like really good example where we were in the battle staff training facility, and we had an infantry officer was the commander for this particular thing, and he came up with a plan. It could have worked, but it would have been, it was a really plotting kind of attack. And I looked at the problem and I said, well, okay, so our objective is there. We can cross over here, like around this narrow point. It's not the most direct route, but because we're mech'd up and we have tanks with us, we can do this, and we can kind of bypass all of this mess that you want to attack through and just go straight for the objective. And I instinctively thought of that, but that's not the way he thought. Like, he saw, okay, well, there's an enemy position here, so we have to fight the enemy. And I said, well, our objective is there, so why don't we go around all of those guys? We can attack the objective, and then, the enemy to fight us would have to, it would basically be a big turning maneuver, and so they'd have to fight from us from a direction for which they were not prepared. And it was, that's just one example. There were a whole lot of examples of that over the years, both EWS and certainly afterwards, when I really realized that being a tank officer just gave me a different view of the battlefield. And so, I mean, I saw it with the infantry, I saw it with artillery, and it was, we really bring that different perspective to planning operations and certainly in their conduct. And that was it was always really satisfying to be able to kind of talk through some of these issues with these people from other military occupational specialties, and so we could learn from each other and we could figure out a better way to operate.
That's great. It's absolutely great. I think it's a lot different moving 60 kilometers per hour with 120 than moving 6 kilometers per hour with a 5.56. So
exactly,
yeah, certainly gives you a different perspective. So obviously this year has been a tough year for everybody, and that's the reason for the channel and the reason for us doing this. 1923, correct me if I'm wrong, I know you're the historian. 1923, light armored tanks, kind of the first ones for the Marine Corps. So we're almost coming upon 100 years, hence the name of the channel here. What is something about the Marine Corps what is something about Marine Corps tanks that you think is just something that we shouldn't forget, and something that is just going to live on at the end of when this whole thing kind of goes away?
Whew. Again, that different approach to the battlefield is very important. Our the way that we instinctually think about combined arms, because we are combined arms, to the infantry in particular. So I think that's really important, to think about how we have to integrate all elements of the MAGTF into achieving that combined arms effect. I think is really important. And that's really, you go back and you look through the history of 1st Tank Battalion and all the operations that it's participated in its history, and you can see the contributions that the tank crewmen have made to those, fighting on islands in the Pacific, and in the jungles of Vietnam, and Desert Storm, and Iraq and Afghanistan. It's been a huge, the Marine tank battalions have contributed greatly to Marine Corps operations throughout all that time. And so I want people to remember that, and to know that while the tanks might be gone from the Marine Corps, it's going to be very difficult to kind of replicate that symbiotic relationship when the tanks are coming from the Army, which is the current plan. So it's, there's going to be some challenges that will be encountered when that happens. Just general integration, because we're not, all Marine officers go to the basic school. All Marines go to the same, go to boot camp together, and so we have kind of that shared experience from day one in the service. And the inter-service, joint operations are very important, but there are a lot of challenges involved in that. And so getting down to the basic unit level that a tank infantry integrated team is going to be a challenge when you don't have that same common heritage that you have when everyone's a Marine.
So no secret, like we mentioned before, that the Marine Corps tankers are going away. That this whole community is coming to an end. Because of that, our tankers and tank officers are going to be required to make a lot of different moves, whether it be lateral transfers, inter-service transfers, or transitioning out of the Marine Corps. Having been successful since you kind of left some time ago now, and obviously having both perspectives now, very successful civilian career in addition to a very illustrious military career. What advice do you have for tankers that are transitioning or going through this lateral move process?
Uh, well, remember where you came from. I tell all of them that, and you are part of a really proud, noble tradition in the Marine Corps tank community. So hopefully they carry that with them wherever they go. To the transitioning Marines, I would tell them that the opportunities to be a tanker are few and far between in the civilian world. So while their specific skills of turning wrenches and putting 3 targets in a 12 inch diameter target at 3,000 meters will not be in high demand in the civilian world. The bigger picture skills are a tank crewman is someone who has demonstrated the ability to work very intimately in a small team. And that's something that's very valuable. You also have the ability, what it's like to work as part of a large network system that is a tank platoon, tank company, tank battalion. And so how to work as a part of that overall system where everyone might be doing separate activities, but they're all working towards one common goal. So that's really valuable. And, there's a whole lot of leadership opportunities too in the tank community. And so definitely highlight that as you're sitting there in your civilian job interviews. For the Marines that are moving into different communities, either within the Marine Corps or even jumping service, to go be a tanker in the Army, which I highly encourage most of them to do, is if you're going into a different community in the Marine Corps, just remember what you learned about how Marine tankers view the battlefield when you go, to wherever. If you move into supply, motor T, like wherever you go, just remember how Marine tankers thought of the battlefield. And as you continue on with your career, and if you're working through plans, think about how the tank battalion would potentially approach that problem, and hopefully you can help guide and influence some of those plans so people do think about the battlefield in as far as terrain features and map sheets go, because that's the way that you can really achieve that combined arms effect to collapse that enemy system, which is the ultimate goal in most military operations, instead of having to bowl right through. So that's something that I would definitely encourage everyone to take with them, and still continue to think about the battlefield that way, and help everyone else see the battlefield that way too.
That's great. That's absolutely great. And people walk in my office, and till the day I'm no longer have an office, I'm going to have a map sheet on the wall, and everyone's going to kind of look at it, especially when I'm not doing, combined arms, not doing tanking any longer. And they're going to wonder why I have that map sheet. But that's a great point. It's to remind me that we deal in map sheets. And I think that
right.
Map sheet can kind of be an analogy for everything going forward. One grid square at a time, 1 meter at a time, but in reality, you got to see the big picture. So that's an absolutely great analogy and great point brought out there. So the project of government oversight. Obviously, this is not something that I don't think when you were 4 years old, you kind of sat around and say, you know what, I'm going to go work for POGO. How did that whole thing kind of come about?
Well, so it came about as a direct result of my experience as a Marine tank officer. My journey to where I am now started at Fort Knox in the fall of 2010, when I got assigned to my third billet at the Marine Corps detachment when it was still at Fort Knox, and I became a tactics instructor for 216 Cavalry. I'd been preparing for that for a while because I kind of knew that was ultimately going to be where I ended up. And but I remember there was a moment when I was teaching the fundamentals of maneuver, and I had a lieutenant ask me a question about tempo, about the concept of tempo, and I could not articulate exactly what that was, because it's definitely, tempo is not synonymous with just raw physical speed on the battlefield. It's a much broader concept than that, but I couldn't articulate it very well. And so I went back and I said, you know what, I need to read up more on this so I can answer these questions. I can be smarter than the lieutenants. And so I went back and I went back and I started reading through MCDP-1 again. And in the course of that, I came across John Boyd's name and maneuver warfare as a warfighting philosophy. And so I said, you know what, I need to understand more about this. So maybe the key to understanding more about maneuver warfare is to understand more about John Boyd. And so I remember I'd seen a biography of John Boyd at the Barnes & Noble there in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. And so I went out and I got a copy of the biography. It's actually kind of right over my shoulder back here. And I read through it in about 2.5 days because it's an absolutely fascinating book. And that was kind of the spark of my maneuver awakening, as I jokingly refer to it now. And so I get more and more interested in maneuver warfare. I learned more, as much about it as I possibly could. Read, just about every book that I could find about it. And then I realized that, hey, you know what? A lot of these guys that participated in this, in the adoption of maneuver warfare in the Marine Corps, are still alive. So I started reaching out to him, and I reached out to Bill Lind, who's now a great friend of mine, and then through him, I was introduced to a man named, he pointed me in the direction of Winslow Wheeler, who was at the time still working at the Project on Government Oversight. And so I found out about this opportunity to come out here. And I guess kind of the rest is history. I certainly did not, at 4 years old, I did not have a burning ambition to be a professional military reformer, because I would have had no idea what that was at that point. But even when I was in the Marine Corps, I didn't think that anything like this, most of the time when I was in the Marine Corps, I didn't think anything like this actually existed. And so, but through my study of maneuver warfare and through the people that I met who had participated in that, I found out about this opportunity, and it really ended up being the absolute definition of luck, which, luck is the intersection of preparation and opportunity. Well, that's exactly what this was, because before my biography, before I joined the Marine Corps, I was a television reporter. And so what the requirements for my position, what I do now, is they needed somebody who understood, who had a military background, somebody who understood John Boyd style military reform, and somebody who was comfortable talking on camera, who could write well, and who could articulate our work to a public audience. So I had inadvertently engineered myself to do this job. So it was an interesting opportunity that was really kind of honed specifically for my professional experiences.
Outstanding. And to just for the audience sake, that is not a green screen behind you. That is in fact your library. And I would be guaranteed to say that most of those books you probably have already read cover to cover at least once, probably more than once. So it's a very impressive library you got there.
Well, that's actually only part of it. So if I turned, you'd see they go further that way and further that way, and there's a whole stack on the other side of the room too.
Of course there is. Of course there is.
Yeah. Giant nerd.
Yeah, circling back to being a tanker. How do you think being a Marine Corps tanker has assisted you along this journey, and actually not just for this journey but for the future?
Again, circling back to that, the ability of being comfortable tackling big, complex problems that to a lot of people I think would appear unsolvable, or just too big to handle. Like I just learned to to think through problems a step at a time, and learn how to work effectively with people who have specific expertise for those particular tasks. Because obviously, as a tank officer, I don't, I know a certain amount about maintenance on a tank, but I'm by no means qualified to pull a pack and replace a wine cup seal or something like that. So, but having the ability to understand what the problem is, and then work with the people who have the special skills necessary to really solve that piece of the problem, and to do that repeatedly across a complex problem is something that it's a valuable skill. It's a challenge that is really unique to not just Marine Corps tanks, but to the military in general. And it's you gain this big broad experience at a very young age in the military that gives you a big advantage over people who have never been put in that position before. Like a lot of people who've never served, have never dealt with something like a tank breaking down 50 kilometers outside of outside of safety, and having to put track back on a tank when you're also under constant threat of sniper fire. That's just something that most civilians will never experience.
Yeah, that's the definition of multitasking. Pulling security and then also having to work through a complex problem, trying to figure out how to fix something. That is the definition of multitasking. That's all the questions I have for you today. I will open up the floor, and if you want to have any parting shots here.
No, just again, just to reiterate that to all the tankers that are that are currently serving, that are working through this transition period, know that all of us that have gone before you, we're right there next to you in spirit. And I know there's a whole big network of Marine tankers that are only too willing to help you out with whatever you need. So please reach out to us, because we're here. We're all brothers in arms. It doesn't matter if we operate on an Abrams or on an M60A3. Like we're all Marine tankers at heart. So definitely reach out. I'm all over the place. You can just Google Dan Grazier and I'll pop up 1,000 times. And so it's not hard to find me. So please, if anybody needs anything, don't hesitate for a second to reach out.
Thank you so much, Dan. This has been great. As I said, you are the inaugural interview. Hopefully there are many more to follow. This will be a series on my LinkedIn, or excuse me, on both my LinkedIn and my Facebook channel, 100 Years of Marine Corps Tankers. For those watching on Facebook, please go ahead and on YouTube, go ahead and please click the subscribe button as well as the notification button. And Dan, thank you so much. I can't thank you enough. It's been an absolute honor, and have a great rest of your day.
Hey, thanks, brother. It's been my honor and privilege.